So,
It's a really interesting field.
yeah, I think it's one of those areas of criminology that maybe doesn't get as much attention as some of the others. We always think about the offenders and the crimes themselves.
Right.
But what about the victims?
Yeah, exactly.
So before we get too far, I mean, how would you even define victimology?
So victimology is the scientific study of victims of crime. It goes beyond simply identifying who was harmed to really understanding the victim's experience, the circumstances that led to the crime, the consequences they face.
So it's really about taking like a much broader view. Not just the crime itself, but the whole context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And recognizing that the impact of crime can be far-reaching.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, this chapter goes into some of the theories behind victimization. Like, why are some people or groups more vulnerable to becoming victims in the first place? And I found that really fascinating, but also a bit tricky.
Yeah, it's a sensitive area to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about why certain people might be more likely to be victims.
Right.
And I think the most important thing to remember is that these theories are not about placing blame on the victims at all.
Right.
It's about understanding the complex interplay of factors that contribute to victimization.
Yeah.
So one of the theories that the textbook talks about is victim precipitation.
Oh, yeah, I was reading about that.
And you can imagine this is a term that sometimes raises eyebrows.
I can see why.
Right, because it kind of suggests that the victim is somehow contributing to the crime.
Yeah, so we got to be really careful about how we explain this.
Absolutely. It's not about blaming the victim at all. It's more about understanding that certain actions or behaviors might unintentionally increase their risk.
Okay, so it's about recognizing patterns and vulnerabilities.
Precise.
Not pointing fingers.
Exactly. So, for example, leaving your car unlocked with the valuables in plain sight might make it a more appealing target for a thief.
Right.
It doesn't make you responsible for the theft,
Of course not.
but it does increase the risk.
Okay, so it's really more about opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
speaking of opportunity, there's another theory that kind of plays into this whole idea, which is lifestyle exposure theory.
Uh-huh.
What's that all about?
So this theory suggests that our everyday routines and the choices we make can influence our risk of becoming a victim.
So, like, if I'm constantly out late at night walking through dark alleys, I'm probably increasing my chances of encountering trouble.
Well, it's not quite as simple as that,
Okay.
but you're right. It's about being aware of your surroundings and the choices you make.
So being aware of your surroundings is key.
Exactly.
Got it.
And then there's another theory that kind of builds on this, which is routine activities theory.
Oh, lay it on me.
This theory kind of breaks down crime into three key elements: a motivated offender, a suitable target, and the absence of a capable guardian.
So it's like all three of these things have to be in place for a crime to be more likely to occur.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So a motivated offender is someone who has the intent to commit a crime. A suitable target is anything that might attract the offender's attention, whether it's a person, a possession, or even a place. And then a capable guardian is anything that might deter the crime, like a security system, a nosy neighbor, good lighting, or even just being aware of your surroundings.
Right.
All of those things can act as capable guardians.
I'm starting to see everyday situations in a whole new light now.
That's how victimology changes your perspective. It makes you think differently about the world around you.
So it's like, if we think about a typical house burglary, the motivated offender is the burglar, the suitable target is the house, and the lack of a capable guardian might be the homeowner being away on vacation.
Exactly. You've got it.
Okay, so that kind of brings together all these different elements.
Yeah. And this theory really helps us understand why certain crimes are more common in certain places or at certain times.
It's fascinating stuff.
It is. It's all about understanding how these elements interact.
Right. So we've talked about some of the theories behind victimization, but what about the impact on the victims themselves?
Right.
Because, it's one thing to say that someone's been victimized, but it's another thing entirely to understand the ripple effects that follow.
Exactly. And that's where I think victimology really shines a light on the often unseen consequences of crime.
What do you mean?
Well, it goes beyond the obvious physical injuries.
Right.
There can be emotional and psychological scars that run much deeper.
Yeah, and those can be much harder to heal.
Absolutely. The textbook actually cites a study that found that 68% of victims of serious violence experienced long-term emotional problems.
Wow, 68%.
That's a huge number.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show that the impact of crime can be really long-lasting.
Yeah, and I imagine things like anxiety, fear, and even PTSD can be incredibly debilitating.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, there's something called secondary victimization.
Secondary victimization. What's that?
So secondary victimization occurs when the response of institutions or individuals actually adds to the victim's trauma.
Oh, wow. So it's like being victimized all over again?
In a way, yes. So,
Huh.
for example, if a victim of sexual assault is subjected to insensitive questioning by the police or judgmental comments from friends and
Oh,
family,
that's terrible.
that would be a form of secondary victimization.
So it's like adding insult to injury.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the need for sensitivity and understanding when dealing with victims of crime.
Okay, so given all of this, how has the justice system evolved in its approach to victims' rights? Because it seems like historically, victims were often treated as an afterthought in the pursuit of justice.
You're absolutely right. If you look back at ancient legal codes like Hammurabi's Code,
Right.
there's a big emphasis on restitution. The offender had to compensate the victim for their losses,
Okay.
but over time, the focus shifted more towards justice for the state.
So it became less about the victim and more about punishing the offender.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah.
But thankfully, things started to change in the 1960s. There was a growing awareness of victims' rights and the need for better support.
It seems like society as a whole was starting to pay more attention to the needs of victims.
Exactly. And this growing awareness led to some major changes in the way we approach victims' rights, culminating in a really important moment for Canada: the introduction of the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights in 2015.
Okay, so this was a big deal.
A huge deal. It was a landmark moment for recognizing and protecting the rights of victims within the legal system.
So what exactly does this bill guarantee for victims?
So the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights establishes a set of statutory rights for victims. It ensures that they have access to information protection, participation in the legal process, and restitution.
So basically, it ensures that victims have a voice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They have a right to be kept informed about their case,
Okay.
to be protected from intimidation,
Right.
and to participate in the legal process.
So it's a huge step forward in terms of recognizing the victim as a key stakeholder in the justice system.
Absolutely.
But I mean, having these rights on paper is one thing, but are they actually being upheld in practice? Are victims truly getting the support they need?
That's a great question. And it highlights the fact that while the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights is a really important step forward, there's still work to be done in terms of implementation and enforcement.
Yeah, I can imagine there might be some gaps between the ideal and the reality.
Absolutely. And that's where the availability of quality victim services becomes really crucial.
Okay, so let's talk about that, because even with rights in place, navigating the justice system can be incredibly daunting, especially when you're also dealing with the trauma of being a victim. What kind of services are available to help people through this process?
Well, there's a whole network of services designed to support victims at every stage, from the initial reporting of a crime to the potential release of the offender, if
Yeah.
applicable.
So it's like a comprehensive system of support.
It's supposed to be. We have police-based services like victim services units that offer immediate support and referrals.
Okay.
There are court-based programs that help victims understand their rights and navigate the complexities of the legal process.
Right.
And then there are correctional services, which include things like victim notification systems that keep victims informed about the offender's custody status.
So it's quite a complex system.
It can be, but the goal is to provide support at every step of the way.
And what about specific organizations that are doing this work? Are there any that come to mind?
Yeah, absolutely. In Ontario, we have Victim Crisis Assistance, Ontario, or VCAO for short.
Okay.
They offer a really wide range of services, including crisis intervention, emotional support, practical help with things like safety planning, and assistance in accessing financial resources.
So they're really there to help victims rebuild their lives.
Exactly. They're doing some amazing work.
That's wonderful to hear. But I mean, I can't help but think that there must be some gaps in the system.
Oh, for sure.
And challenges in ensuring that every victim gets the support they need.
You're absolutely right. There's always room for improvement.
Yeah, and another complex issue is that of restitution and compensation.
Right.
Because becoming a victim of a crime often comes with a huge financial burden.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Medical bills, lost wages, you name it.
Yeah, so how do those concepts fit into the picture?
So victim restitution is when the offender is ordered by the court to financially compensate the victim for their losses.
Right.
It's about holding the offender accountable
Yeah.
and helping the victim on the road to recovery.
But what happens if the offender simply can't afford to pay?
That's where victim compensation programs come in.
Oh, okay.
These are government-run programs that provide financial assistance to victims, covering things like medical expenses, lost wages, and even pain and suffering.
So it's kind of like a safety net.
Exactly. It's there to ensure that victims aren't left to shoulder the financial burden alone, regardless of the offender's situation.
That makes sense. So there are multiple avenues for victims to seek financial support.
Exactly.
But I imagine there's probably a lot of debate about how these programs should be structured, funded, who should be eligible, and all that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And there have been some recent changes here in Ontario that have been quite controversial. For example, the Ontario Criminal Injuries Compensation Board has shifted away from providing direct financial awards.
Really?
Yeah, and they're now focusing more on supporting access to specific services for victims.
So it's like a whole new approach.
It is. And it's sparked a lot of debate about whether it's a step forward or a step backward.
Yeah, because I can see both sides of that argument.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Well, this has been so eye-opening already. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
We got a lot more to unpack. And next we'll be diving into some of the big picture questions about the future of victimology.
I'm ready for it. Let's keep exploring.
Sounds good. You know, it's interesting. Our textbook actually points out that even with all the progress we've made in recognizing victims' rights, there's still this lack of trust in the system as a whole.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I mean, change takes time, right? Especially when we're talking about something as big and complex as the justice system.
Absolutely.
So what did the textbook highlight specifically as needing improvement?
Well, it cites a 2014 report that found that a surprisingly high number of Canadians just don't have a lot of confidence in the criminal justice system.
Wow, that's pretty concerning. I mean, it seems like there's a real disconnect between what the system is supposed to be doing and how people are actually experiencing it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this lack of confidence probably stems from a lot of different factors.
Yeah,
You know, concerns about fairness and transparency,
right.
whether the system is actually effective.
So even with the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights, there's still a feeling that the system isn't quite living up to its promises.
It seems that way. And it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to have rights written down on paper.
Right.
It's another thing to actually see them being upheld and respected in practice.
It's kind of like having a toolbox full of shiny new tools.
Mm.
But then you realize you don't actually know how to use them properly.
Exactly. And that's why the work of victimologists and victim advocates is so important. They're the ones who are constantly pushing for better policies, improved services, and greater accountability within the justice system.
So it's not just about studying the problem. It's
Right.
about actually trying to solve it.
Absolutely. It's about taking action, using research and knowledge to advocate for real change.
That's really inspiring. So besides all these challenges, are there any kind of emerging trends or new ideas in victimology that give you hope for the future?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of really cool stuff happening.
Yeah.
One thing that's gaining a lot of traction is the idea of restorative justice.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that term before. But I'm not really sure what it looks like in practice. What is restorative justice all about?
So restorative justice shifts the focus away from punishment and towards repair.
Okay.
It's about bringing together the victim, the offender, and sometimes even the community to really try and address the harm that was caused.
So it's less about retribution and more about healing and reconciliation.
Precisely. It's about acknowledging the impact of the crime on everyone involved.
And finding a way to move forward.
Exactly. In a way that promotes accountability, understanding, and restoration.
That sounds really powerful. But I can also imagine it being really challenging to actually pull off.
It can be, but there are some amazing programs out there that are doing this really effectively.
Are there any examples that come to mind?
One example is victim-offender mediation,
Okay.
where victims actually have a chance to meet with the person who harmed them
Oh, wow.
in a safe and structured environment.
That must take incredible courage on the part of the victim.
It does.
Yeah.
And it's really important to emphasize that this approach isn't suitable for every situation or every victim,
Right.
but for some people it can be incredibly healing. It allows them to have their voices heard, ask questions, express their feelings, and potentially find some closure.
It sounds like it has the potential to really transform the way we think about justice.
Right. It's not just about punishing the offender.
Right.
It's about addressing the harm and trying to help everyone involved move forward in a positive way.
Wow, this has been such an eye-opening depth dive. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of this field.
I'm glad to hear that.
So as we kind of start to wrap up our deep dive into victimology, what are some of the key things you hope our listeners will take away from this conversation?
Well, first and foremost, I hope they've gained a deeper appreciation for just how complex victimization really is.
Right.
It's not a simple issue with easy answers. It requires a nuanced understanding of individual choices, societal factors, systemic issues.
It's about recognizing the big picture.
Exactly. And I also hope they've developed a greater sense of empathy for victims of crime.
Hmm.
Their experiences are often overlooked or minimized.
It's so important to listen to their story.
Yes, and to really understand the challenges they face.
I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from this whole deep dive for me is that it's not just about asking what happened.
Right.
It's about really understanding the impact and trying to see things from the victim's perspective.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And finally, I hope our listeners feel inspired to learn more about this field,
Yeah.
to support the work of victimologists and victim advocates.
Because ultimately, they're the ones who are fighting for a more just and compassionate system.
Exactly.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah.
This is a topic I'm really passionate about, and I always love having these kinds of discussions.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery into the world of victimology.
We hope you found it insightful.
Yeah, and as we always say, this is just the beginning.
There's so much more to explore.
So keep those curious minds engaged, and we'll see you back here next time for another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, happy exploring.
Okay, so for our listeners who are like, whoa, victimology is fascinating, I want to learn more.
Yeah.
Where would you point them? Are there any good resources or organizations they could check out? Absolutely. A great starting point would be to look into organizations like the Canadian Resource Center for Victims of Crime. They've got a ton of resources and information about victim services.
That's a good one. What
Yeah.
about on a more international level?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The International Victimology Institute, that's a fantastic resource for understanding, the broader landscape of victimology.
Okay, perfect. So we've got some online resources. And then, of course, there are always books, documentaries, even fictional accounts that can give you a really powerful glimpse into, what it's like to be a victim.
Oh, absolutely. I think storytelling can be such a powerful tool
Yeah.
for building empathy and understanding.
It's like sometimes hearing a personal story can really bring these concepts to life
Exactly.
in a way that, just reading statistics and theories can't always do.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, this has been an incredible conversation.
It has.